that this year, 2010, is going to break the record book again and be the hottest year on record since measurements began. And this is all wrapped up in a hugely complex scientific review held by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in their report in 2007, they brought this message to the world. They explained that climate change is happening, there is no longer any doubt, and in fact, the warming of the climatic system is now unequivocal. And this is evident from observations in increases in global average air and ocean temperature, melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level. So the story really isn't being debated in scientific realms anymore. The story of climate change is being debated in the media. It's being debated in places that really there is a huge sort of gap between the knowledge. And the scary part about all of this is if we carry on the way we're going, by the end of this century, we're likely to see a planet about 4 degrees on average warmer than it was back when James Watt started up his steam engine. Now, 4 degrees mightn't sound like an awful lot, but 4 degrees is really enormous at a global level. If we think of an analogy to try and understand that a little bit better, think of your own body when you get a fever. Okay? Average body temperature in and around 37 degrees centigrade. Well, the Earth's temperature back when James Watt was and the Industrial Revolution was just kicking off was about 13.5 degrees centigrade. We're now having a bit of a fever. We felt the temperature of the planet increase by about 1 degree since then, about 0.8 of a degree in the last 100 years. And if we carry on where we're going, we will be up to 4 degrees above that temperature. Now, if you had a body temperature of just 3.5 degrees above normal, you would be in the emergency ward. It's that subtle, and we need to understand climate change in that sort of a way. The way that if we allow our body or our planet to increase by 3 or 4 degrees, we really are into an emergency state. The main output from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had 5 basic messages for us. The first was that we're likely to see temperature increase of between 2 and 6 degrees centigrade over the next 100 years. Sea level is likely to rise by about 1.5 meters over the next 100 years. Continuing loss of snow cover and melting of permafrost in the northern areas of the world. Increases in extreme hurricanes and typhoons, and also increases in extreme weather, particularly heat waves and extreme rainfall. If we just take a look at the sea level story and some implications for Ireland, well, this is Shannon Airport with 1 metre rise in sea level. Or if we go up to Galway and we take a look at the recent Mutton Island wastewater treatment facility built up there, at huge expense, we start to see that that is a piece of national infrastructure. At 1 metre rise in sea level, we have to question its viability. So if science is telling us that these are the likely projections into the next 100 years, well then we need to start thinking about where we build things and how we build things. Coming back to those 5 steps and looking at something more like the very extreme hot weather or extreme rainfall events, and if we start to take a look at that within an Irish context, think back to last November and the great floods of 2009, as I call them. Sure enough, that was an extreme weather event. My hometown of Bandon in Cork was absolutely washed out by that. There are still shops on the main street in Bandon recovering from that enormous deluge of water. This is a friend of mine, the Lyonses, a small hardware shop on the main street. Look how high the high water mark got on that in that house. That is normally about 6 meters above where the river normally is. So really, it was an extraordinary event coming in over a period of about 2 days. The shop completely written off. In fact, they're no longer in business, they've shut down. They were retiring at the time, but really that was the last straw. And when we take a look at Met Éireann's report as to what happened in November 2009, it was notable, first of all, that Ireland experienced extreme weather measurements across an awful lot of its weather stations. For example, in Valencia, where they've been measuring since the 1850s or 1860s, it was the highest that they have ever measured in rainfall in that November. When we take a look at the average rainfall across the month of November, we take a look at most parts of the country experiencing twice to 3 times the normal rainfall in November 2009. And scientists, meteorologists have a term which is the return rate. When are we likely to see something like that happening again? Well, we can see over large portions of the country, it was running between a 400 or a 500-year flooding event. In other words, we shouldn't see that kind of event for another 400 or 500 years. But the trouble with climate change is that we're likely to see these events on an increasing number of times. In fact, measurements on a recent EPA report, only published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, is telling us that since the 1970s, rainfall in Ireland has increased by 10%, so have the number of extreme weather events. So it's happening now, and it's accelerating. So this really does require us to think about how we might adjust to it. There really is a most important climate for change. We need to adjust our way of thinking. And as Albert Einstein said, problems cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them in the first place. The first thing that we really need to do is change our relationship with this molecule, carbon dioxide, and its unique ability to hold heat, and our unique ability to keep pumping it into the atmosphere. Because each of us has a personal carbon bubble. Each of us is accountable for a certain amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere. And science is telling us that we need to take that under control. We need to adjust the way we emit it. Certainly the evidence would suggest, with all of the political movements and all of the efforts to control our emissions, we're really not doing much about it. We see here on this timeline the release of the global amount of carbon going into our atmosphere and the political sort of stage posts along the way. So we haven't by any means reached a point where we're starting to reduce our emissions. Yes, this year, because of the economic downturn, there is some reduction in Ireland's emissions, but the concern is if we go back to the way we were, we will just pick up again. And also there is an inequity in the way these emissions are made. We see that most of them are coming from the developed north, and the poor developing countries of the world really are not responsible for this. And if we take in the historical carbon dioxide since Mr. Watt and the Industrial Revolution back in 1750s, we start to see that there is a huge onus on the developed world to actually take ownership of this issue. In Ireland, each of us produces about 17 tonnes of carbon dioxide per person per year. The average human citizen is producing about 5.5 tonnes of carbon per person per year. So here in Ireland, we're way above what is the global average for carbon emissions. And every part of that 17 tonnes comes from daily actions, things that we make decisions, products that we decide to purchase, lifestyle choices that we have, transport decisions that we make. Each one of those actions is responsible for a certain amount of carbon into our atmosphere. And adding those up, decision by decision, purpose or purchase by purchase, we come to that 17 tonnes here in Ireland. But the important thing here is not so much the amount. The important thing here is measuring. Until we start to measure the amount of carbon that we actually produce, are we likely to do anything about it? If it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. So all of these day-to-day activities are bringing the average Irish citizen to 17 tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere every year. Science is telling us that we need to bring that down to about 1 or 2 tonnes by 2050. That, folks, is not switching off your mobile phone charger. That, folks, is not turning your television off standby. That is almost a war effort if we think about it in the context of that degree of change within such a period of time. But if we're not going to go towards a planet of 4 or 5 or 6 degrees warmer by the end of this century, that's the scale of the task ahead of us. We need to kick our CO2 habit. We need to take a coordinated readjustment to how we do things. We need to plan, we need to commit, we need to identify where we can make changes. We need to put in place an action plan and implement that and review it on an annual basis across all parts of the way that we run things. That is by no means a